Hello there. My name is Simon Walker, and I am the co-founder of a company called FSP. We work with a wide range of customers to deliver cloud platforms, data platforms, AI solutions, and custom applications. I will talk briefly about our business shortly, but for the moment, I wanted to thank you for watching this presentation. I hope you find it valuable. My aim in putting this together was to provide a little bit of insight and perhaps a bit of reassurance to those in a CIO or sort of digital leadership role of our commonality of challenge across industry and how we can perhaps come together and benefit from a shared experience and come up with some ideas about how we can make our roles either easier or more valuable to the business. Before we start, I think it's really important to recognise that COVID-19 is clearly a human tragedy, and we really should take a moment to pay our respects to those who have lost their lives and the impact upon their families. I think it was quite a difficult decision to actually do this presentation because of that, and I hope that all of us can find some time to reflect on the seriousness of the situation and our contribution to it as we move forward. This presentation will talk about the perspective of a number of CIOs and digital leaders as they ran up to lockdown, during lockdown, and indeed to present day, where we're seeing a continuation of the challenges from the last 6 months. We'll talk about some common themes that are occurring and the impact on digital agenda, and at the end we'll list some of the key actions that we think need some consideration from people who are in a digital leadership role. Before we start, just a little bit about me. I've been in the sort of IT space since the age of 18, so started out with kind of mainframe technology and have seen obviously a lot of change over the years. And latterly, although I'm technical in background and still enjoy the odd bit of pressing keys and playing with technology, largely speaking now, what interests me is the impact of digital capabilities onto a business and how we can apply them in the best way. So my life now is spent dealing with customers, working out their digital strategy, their data strategies, making sure they're business aligned, making sure that the organization understands what it's going to get, how it's going to get there, and how it knows when it's got there. So I guess I speak to a lot of CIOs as part of that role, and again, that's one of the reasons why I thought it was interesting. I'm seeing a level of commonality of discussion despite the different industries and the different impacts on different industries, and I thought it'd be valuable to share that experience. A little bit about FSP. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Don't want to take you away from the purpose of this presentation, but I think it's relevant for us to talk a little bit about what we do. So as you've already guessed, we focus on kind of building solutions for people around digital, data, AI, building custom cloud apps. We have a particular focus around the intersection of people and digital and data, and what does that mean? I guess a while back we realized that you can build really, really great solutions, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a business gets benefit for them or uses them or adopts them in any meaningful way. So we started to really focus on the people impact, and we have a pretty mature change enablement team that help organizations to adopt the solutions that we build. And I think that creates a blend of tech, consulting capability at a business level, and change capability to help organizations adopt new approaches to things that is quite valuable. And we've used a lot of those techniques over the years to help us also to become a great place to work. So we're current holders of the Great Place to Work award for medium organizations. We're #1 in that. We've won it 2 times previous to that, and as you can see on the slide there, we've won various other kind of accolades in terms of our approach to how we employ our people. I think it's quite interesting that a lot of the techniques we use to engage our people are equally applicable to our engagements. So we want to make sure that our customers feel engaged with the solutions that we are delivering, and that your users actually as well are engaged with that solution. So I think it's potentially reassuring for you watching that actually someone who understands how to make a great place to work can also create a great experience for a customer. I'm not going to go into any detail about what we deliver as technology stacks. I've already mentioned we do data AI. We do a lot of work around Microsoft 365, Azure-based solutions and custom cloud apps, Power Platform, those sorts of things. So you'll recognise most of those technologies, and I wrap around them of strategy and change, and obviously things like service and support, managed service, that sort of side of things. We also recently have launched a product called Pulse 360, which came out of our need to engage both our employees and our customers. And it's an application that is aimed at garnering feedback, either prompted or unprompted, and also providing a mechanism to assess people's performance or progress against a particular set of goals that a business might have, particularly with a focus on kind of engagement and progression against I don't know, it's like a vision and a mission and a strategy or a change program inside a business. So on to the presentation. The scale of C-19, even as we speak now, at this particular time, going into in the UK a second wave, has been massive, and I think we're only beginning to realise actually that the extent to which C-19 is impacting our lives. What is really clear though is that technology has been absolutely on the front lines of having to respond to this. And it was mainly for that reason that I wanted to understand a bit more about the CIO perspective. So what was happening for a CIO, and what were the challenges they were facing? And I think that given there's a big dependency on technology through this period, that CIOs will have a pretty unique view on the challenges that their organisations have faced and how technology has impacted that. So I spoke to a small cohort of respected CIOs. I didn't pick a particular industry. I picked CIOs from finance, charity, retail, transport, health, construction, primarily actually. Obviously, a lot of these industries have been affected in different ways, but I was looking for sort of, is there a common thread running through the thought processes that CIOs have and the challenges they've faced? So actually it's been quite interesting to do that, because there are areas where there's definite levels of commonality, which we'll talk about shortly. Just wanted to kind of set the scene a little bit from a technology point of view. Most of you will be aware of these sorts of things. So the primary impact that we've seen through C-19 from a business perspective is obviously people moving to remote working, for those organisations that can do that. And in certain industries, we're talking about a shift to 75% of the workforce moving to working from home from, say, a 10% value. So on average, it's between a 30 to 70% shift in the remote working patterns across different types of industries. So that's a massive change to the dynamic of work, a massive change to the impact of the use of technology as well. So quite interesting if you look at the challenge that left with people like Microsoft in terms of scaling up Microsoft Teams, where you look at a need to scale your service between 5 to 6 times in a very short period in time. I think actually, generally speaking, that happened very successfully, both for Microsoft and for other providers of this sort of technology. And I think actually the cloud's been proven to be a massive benefit for organisations in that respect. Scaling up your internal infrastructure would be incredibly challenging in that timescale, and it's pretty impressive actually that the industry as a whole has managed to scale up and respond to this in the time that it did. Obviously, Zoom had a very similar experience, a massive rise in the number of daily active users. So again, a really good example of how the scale changed massively over a very, very short period in time, and the industry needed to respond to that. So I think it's quite an interesting challenge there that people have seen. And these tools obviously have been the primary tools for people to stay connected. And I think it's been interesting, again, talking to CIOs about how that has affected their business. And in many instances, actually, it's created a higher level of connection. There's a quote there talking about closer relationships between departments. I think what happened is that people compensated for the fact they weren't seeing people and made kind of active preparation to think about how they could connect to people better, how they could talk to other departments. It's been very interesting to see that. Obviously, sustaining that over the long term is a bit of a challenge. Again, we've got some comments on that later from CIOs about some of the challenges they're facing there. But in the short term, a lot of our participants in the survey basically said that communication had improved. Just touching briefly on the benefits of remote working. Again, not going to spend a lot of time on this. You will understand some of this. A lot of people that we interviewed did talk about the commute time and getting some time back in their day. Interestingly, most of our CIOs also recognised that commute time they used to work and extend their days, which again perhaps is an interesting thing to think about over the longer run if we continue to stay in a remote working environment. What is fascinating, actually, again, pretty much universally, is that the transition from office working to remote working had to deal with the problem that people have around whether people are productive at home. And it's very interesting that for many, many years, people have been talking about people who work from home are actually productive. They tend to overcompensate for the fact they are working from home and work longer hours. And actually, we've seen broadly that's exactly what's happened for most people. People have put in extra time through a combination of the fact they're working remotely and that most businesses are under stress. So we've seen some pretty impressive productivity gains actually from a lot of organisations. Obviously, there's some sectors that have had some big impacts that negatively gave them problems with productivity. But the majority of people we've spoken to have said that their people have been more productive through this period. So I thought we'd start talking from the start, really. So we all got a little bit of a warning before we went into lockdown. I think most of us saw that coming and had time to think about what that meant. And I think generally speaking, most of the CIOs I spoke to felt well prepared. And a lot of them had already invoked their business continuity plans, had already started to think about how they were going to transition into remote working, and pretty universally people felt pretty well prepared. That wasn't to say that it wasn't a very busy time and a very stressful time, and actually one of the interesting observations from a few people was that it was very difficult to test. So as people were running up into their BC plan and thinking about what lockdown looked like, it was pretty much impossible to simulate what lockdown was going to look like. So there was a level of nervousness as people went into lockdown, but it was managed generally fairly well by most CIOs we spoke to. They were pretty happy with what had happened, and there was a level of surprise actually that users adjusted very quickly. And I think we'll touch on that a bit later actually in terms of how well users generally tended to adjust to remote working. I think the other interesting thing was those people that were further down on their cloud journey had a much better experience in transitioning to a lockdown environment. That would seem fairly obvious, but I think it's an impressive aspect of the cloud that things managed to accelerate as fast as they did into a lockdown environment. So I think it's quite interesting from a general perspective that it went a lot smoother than most people perhaps would have predicted a week before lockdown. I was very interested in, through lockdown and through the C-19 pandemic as we stand now and obviously into the future, what impact would that have on people's digital strategies? And again, some very interesting correlations here generally across industry. So 82% of people that we spoke to said it had accelerated their digital agenda. And as it says on the slide there, 67% felt it was impacting them to the extent of accelerating between 1 and 3 years. So that's quite an interesting statistic to look at. And actually, what a lot of people now are turning their minds to is having at least moved into a cloud first type strategy, starting to think about remote first. And everything they do now, they're thinking about how could you operate this in a remote way? how could it be done in a way that means that if there's a further lockdown or people want to work more from home, how will this solution and this platform support that? And I think a remote first approach is a good strategy for people moving forward. I think the other interesting thing about the digital strategy and why it's accelerated is that as we went into lockdown and the focus came around technology to come up with some of the answers, the profile of IT became much more prevalent within the business. And so again, the majority of people we spoke to have managed to accelerate their relationship with the board, with the exec within the business, and there's a much more meaningful dialogue going on between IT and the board in most instances around how the future might develop. And I think actually a growing realization that the digital strategy that you've had in the past really now is becoming the business strategy. We've been seeing this for a while now. You know, basically people who have IT strategies, sometimes they have very poor alignment with the business strategy. Nowadays that's quite rare to see. They're pretty well aligned. I think over the coming years we will see basically an IT strategy is the business strategy. So and I think we're already seeing some of our stakeholders that we spoke to in this session confirming that. Just from a productivity perspective, again, I guess people had no real idea as we went into lockdown in particular what the impact on productivity would be. It's been, again, a more positive message than perhaps we would have expected. So, you know, 3/4 of the people we spoke to said they'd either experienced no impact or an increase. The majority actually felt there'd been some form of increase. I guess the concern was that people would be unproductive working from home, and certainly there's been challenges for people, especially when schools went into lockdown and you know, suddenly people have got sort of very disruptive days and that sort of stuff. But again, people have behaved very sensibly as a rule across every industry to address that. People have generally used their travel time to be more productive, extending their day. Not sure, again, speaking to the CIOs that I spoke to, that that's a sustainable position, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But also there's been a more focused attitude. I think maybe the challenge that C-19 introduced did really give people focus about, okay, how am I going to contribute? How am I going to make the best out of my day? How am I going to make sure that I'm contributing the most value to the business at this point in time? I think there is a risk that we're starting to see now, that the mentality of, you know, you need to be present in the office is now getting replaced with you need to be present at your screen. We're starting to see some organizations looking at techniques for tracking when you're at your keyboard or when you're in front of your laptop or your device, to understand about, you know, basically, are you present? I don't actually think that's hopefully going to be something that gets widely adopted. I think trying to maintain that trust with people within the business, I think, has delivered major productivity benefits. If we start to try to think about how we can monitor people's usage and time they're spending in front of a machine, etc., I suspect we might lose some of those productivity gains, certainly in service and knowledge-based businesses. In relation to change, again, a massive change that happened in a very, very short timescale. People would have had really no idea about how a business might have reacted to that, and clearly most people were pretty nervous about that. But interestingly, the transition was smoother than people thought, and about 70% of the people we spoke to recognised that they could make changes faster in the business than they had previously assumed, and are going to try and take that forward, basically. I think probably people generally realised it was an adverse situation and therefore steeled themselves for some extra effort. There was a level of I guess unusual aspect to what was happening, which again focused people's minds, I think. And so actually this change was made very, very quickly, partially driven by adversity. There is a big question about how can that be sustained, and I think perhaps part of the things we need to think about as CIOs is what are the characteristics of C-19 that meant that people actually worked it out for themselves. One of our CIOs we interviewed said, that their help desk calls decreased because people were sorting it out for themselves. If their mouse broke, they might have a mouse in a drawer and they get their own mouse out and plug it in. Whereas in a normal setting, they might have phoned the help desk and said, my mouse is broken, can you please send me a new one? So it's sort of a different approach to things. And I think partially that was due to a number of different things. People felt they were helping by making a change fast. People felt safer to make those changes because it was a difficult situation. And so there was the risk of trying something and getting something wrong was like you're just trying to get the job done. So people felt safer to make the decisions. And I think absolutely everything that people were doing got reduced to basics. So it's like, what's the most important thing I can be doing today? And I think maybe there's a lesson learned there about when we're thinking about change programs, about particularly how can we make things safe for people? How can we get down to the absolute basics of the change that we're trying to make and support people through that change? I believe that most organisations will look to be making changes faster moving forward. I think a really good example perhaps as well is when you think about how things work in the consumer world, people don't tend to worry about how they turn something on, how they use something. So if you buy a device, you get it out of the box, you plug it in, you turn it on, you expect it to work, you expect it to guide you through the process. You don't feel that you need to read the manual. You don't feel that you need to be careful. In the commercial world, the business world, people feel differently. They feel like if they haven't been trained properly, that they can't use the system. They feel risk when they get something wrong. And again, I think there's an interesting thing to think about based on the interviews that we've conducted about how can you create platforms and solutions that make people feel it's okay to get it wrong, make people feel that it's okay to try something so that they can learn for themselves rather than wait to be taught. I think the final piece that's interesting about the change is the appetite for risk. So everyone agreed that the appetite for risk changed in C-19. So businesses were prepared to take a lot more risk, and they did. I think if you're a CIO, it would be important to think about what's the risk appetite moving forward. That's not to say that you can sustain the current risk appetite, because for many of you in certain regulated industries, that would be very difficult to achieve. But I do think, actually, generally speaking, understanding where the boundary is between where we were before, which was for a lot of organisations either no risk or very little risk, to actually be able to move at pace and take a little higher risk, I think is an interesting debate to have internally within your organisation. A little bit about cloud acceleration. So what was the impact on people's adoption of cloud? Most people, it has accelerated their cloud journey. I don't think there's that much really to say about that. You would have expected that to happen. We did have some customers that were already very mature in their adoption of cloud, so with a fairly small number that actually have pretty much completed their transition, who have pretty much no on-premise infrastructure at all, entirely using either platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, or platforms like Microsoft 365. They were very well placed to deal with COVID. They had a very little challenge from a technical point of view at all, and I think that's an interesting direction that people need to think about. So I think generally speaking, it wouldn't be a big surprise for you to hear that most of the people we interviewed are looking to accelerate their journey into the cloud as fast as they can, particularly if the pandemic remains and there might be future lockdowns. So trying to get into the cloud so it makes life a bit easier is an important thing to do moving forward. Just want to talk a little bit about the impact on culture. I think most people actually felt that there had been some kind of positive impact on the culture. This was a bit of a surprise. Maybe it's the context that that we need to think about here. The positive impact, I think, for some was about work-life balance. So a lot of people feel there's a better work-life balance now, and whether that's sustainable in the long run is a question. But definitely, most people made a comment that they felt that was a positive impact on the culture. Perhaps a bit more challenging is how do you maintain the actual culture of the business itself, the values, and there is definitely a challenge there for people to maintain that. A lot more effort needs to go into communications to remind people of the values of the business that you work for, how they should behave, what's expected of them. That's a very easy thing to do relatively when you're talking about working in an office. When you've got a completely disparate workforce, trying to maintain that common thinking is a big challenge. The other interesting challenge that I think people have faced is the ability to innovate. Most of you will recognise the sort of going from one meeting to another. The meetings tend to be a lot more focused. They tend to not have the introduction. You don't get the think time walking from one meeting to another, so a little bit of time to kind of absorb what you've done. And most of us are still struggling with managing our diaries to the extent to allow a virtual impact of that, so that you can find a way of kind of absorbing what you've just learnt in a meeting and getting ready for the next one. So I think that kind of capability needs looking at if we're going to continue to work remotely, either to specifically include innovation as an agenda in some senses, or to use tools that foster innovation. There are quite a few out there now that allow for kind of innovation type meetings to take place. A couple of our interviewees mentioned a product called Miro, which we use as well, which is a good kind of whiteboarding type application, and there's stuff in Microsoft 365 that allows that sort of technology as well now. So maybe taking a different approach to that, and also a couple of our interviewees are actively looking at how they can change their innovation agenda. I think that's quite an interesting thing to think about. So how are you going to make innovation happen in a remote world, and what are the things that you need to think about to make that happen? A little bit about spending. Again, kind of an interesting stat here. Half of the people we spoke to are seeing an increase in their forward budget. They're being given more money to do the job. That was a bit of a surprise, because again, most businesses are clearly very nervous about budgets and money and cash at the moment. But I think it does indicate the importance of digital in solving this problem, and the fact that the business has recognised that at a senior level and therefore needs to invest. I think there are others that aren't seeing an increase, but actually talking to them in a bit more detail, have accelerated various changes to their plans, which means that legacy systems are being retired faster, and savings that you were planning to make are going to come in earlier, which means that there is kind of a net increase in spend on new technology versus old technology that's happening pretty much universally. I think it does indicate that most organisations that we spoke to are looking very closely at their roadmap, looking very closely at their strategy and their procurement strategies, and how they're going to refresh those moving forward in response to the pandemic. And for most of you, I guess that's already started, but it's certainly a big thing to think about. I think there was another interesting correlation between people who had an increased budget and another factor, which was how engaged the senior leadership team within the business had become through the process. So for those CIOs that had managed to change the nature of their relationship with their senior leadership and up their profile, create an enhanced level of dialogue between them and the business, they were typically seeing an increase in expenditure being made available to them to do new things. So I guess the call to action there for me would be, if you haven't made active efforts to A, increase your profile, B, increase your dialogue, and see increase your relevance to the senior leadership team within your business, then maybe that's something you should be focusing in on quite closely, I think, because there is no doubt that you are, all of us who are in the digital world are very valuable to the business. And I think there's a massive opportunity to leverage the fact that this has been proved through C-19. So what does it look like in the future? How is this going to develop? How's this going to move forward? We asked our CIOs what the focus area was going to be for them moving forward, and it was a fascinating response. Overwhelmingly, CIOs spoke about staffing and culture. Technology was not their concern. I think this is quite an interesting thing to think about in the terms of the evolution of the role of the CIO. For a while, people like Gartner have been saying that you should be getting closer to people like HR and facilities inside your business as there becomes awareness of the need for the correct use of digital technology. Most software providers, significantly Microsoft, have a big focus on business change now and how you can drive adoption of the product. And I think all of our CIOs really had recognised that and recognised that they were pretty unique in their position to be able to take a view about the application of digital technology to people, and that was becoming a real focus for them about how they would do that. So I think that was quite an interesting outcome. And again, really what I think that indicates is that technology is becoming easier and easier and easier to deploy. I'm not saying it's easy. We all spend our days trying to wrestle with some of this stuff. But what the real problem is the correct application of that technology inside your business and getting it adopted well. And CIOs are more focused on that and how their solutions can impact the culture. And I think that's the right way to go. I think increasingly that will be the job, because digital transformation, including the word really, it's about transformation, and the digital piece is actually pretty simple to understand and pretty binary as to whether you've delivered some technology or you haven't. The transformation piece, a lot harder. Getting people to change, we all know, is very, very challenging, very, very difficult. So I think it was fascinating to see CIOs really focused in on that, and actually quite encouraging. In terms of positive outcomes that everyone thought would come out of this, home working, people felt was a positive outcome. Flexible working, basically allowing people to make the best of their day. That's been absolutely necessary through C-19 with homeschooling and that sort of side of things. And I think most of our CEOs are expecting that to continue as time moves forward, allowing people to do work in the best way that suits them within the boundaries of what's required from them clearly. And most of them were seeing a productivity increase that would be sustained over time because of the ability to be more flexible, because of the ability to work from home, and the fact that trust has been established now in that area. So quite a positive outcome from that, I think. And whilst there is clearly a drive to return back to the office and to return to a level of normality, again, most of the people that we interviewed don't see it returning entirely back to normal. They think some of these changes are pretty permanent, and I would tend to agree with them. So in terms of outcomes, there were some negatives that people highlighted. Clearly mental health is a big concern, recognising the fact that not everyone finds working from home a beneficial thing. Particularly people who are at the kind of early stages of their career. A, they want to be working with other people face to face a lot of the time. B, there are relationships that get established through being present in an office where they meet senior people. It's much more easy to create relationships that are meaningful and to feel connected to the organisation. So I think that's something that particularly is a challenge. And obviously, all of us have to think about how we create environments that are good for people and preserve their mental health. The other big thing that people have definitely raised is meeting fatigue. Most of our CIOs were feeling that themselves and are recognising that through their entire organisations. The nature of the communications that we do now means that the breaks that we have between meetings, as I've already mentioned, the preamble that you might get as you walk into a room and say hello to everyone, that sort of stuff, that tends to disappear. You have a remote call, the agenda starts straight away. For most of us, we've reduced the duration of our meetings from hour to 45 minutes to half hour to 15 minutes, so they become very focused, and you go from meeting to meeting to meeting, and actually, again, from someone who actually tries to do a lot of 15-minute meetings, you know at the end of the day that you had a day of 15-minute meetings, because it's quite tiring. So that's been recognised, and I think again CIOs are at the forefront of thinking about this actually, and how that can be resolved, because you know CIOs have that unique perspective of digital and people that they're thinking about. So we've seen different people do different things. So commonly now a day is getting allocated a no meeting Friday or a no meeting Thursday or something, so you don't allow meetings on that particular day, particularly group meetings. Some are establishing call meeting hours. There was one customer who established 10 till 12 and 2 till 4 as call meeting hours, and outside of that time you weren't supposed to have meetings. For most of us that's terrifying, only having 4 hours a day to do meetings. But it's an interesting challenge, right? It's like, well, the question is if you need to spend more than 4 hours a day in a meeting, then when are you getting the work done that perhaps you need to be getting done? And it's an interesting challenge to think about. I think the most common thing we're seeing is the emergence of an etiquette that says if you see in someone's diary that they've got back-to-back meetings for 2 hours, then don't put another back-to-back meeting on them. And I think it will become more acceptable for people to start to decline those things and say, look, I'm sorry, I need to cater for a break in this. I need some time to absorb my last meeting and go into my next one, and hopefully that will emerge naturally over time. Certainly some of our participants are driving that very consciously as a CIO, and thinking about those behaviours and publicising them out to the organisation. So really interesting that people are focusing in on that, and interesting that the CIO is driving that as well. The final negative is culture is harder. So maintaining that culture that you maybe you've worked really hard, as we do in FSP, to maintain across a bunch of people that are working remotely, where it's harder to connect to them, and harder for them to feel connected to the organisation, is something that we're all going to have to work very hard on. I don't think anyone's got all the answers at this point in time. Certainly upping the level of communications has been one thing. Connecting people in different ways has been another. Making sure that you do find time to have those I guess less formal conversations about how people are feeling, where they see their direction is, what's good, what's bad, all those sorts of things. People need to make a more conscious effort to have those discussions, and again, a lot of our CIOs are putting in processes, in fact, to try and make sure those things happen. So positives and negatives. I think the upside, I think, is that actually there were a number of positives that perhaps some of us were expecting, but wouldn't have put a massive amount of money on at the time. But it looks like, hey, you know, productivity, flexible working, all these things that we talked about for a long time, they look like they're here to stay. And I think that's generally a pretty good thing for businesses and for the people that work in them. So the other thing as well in the future, so look, hey, one of the things that C-19 has proved is, you know, we were all right all along. We're really important people to the business, right? Digital is really important. CIOs are really important, and everyone that works in the organisation related to digital is massively important to us. So I think that's a great thing. Look, leverage that, right? So one of the things that I think people have done pretty successfully in some areas is to leverage the fact that they've helped the business, make sure the business is aware about the effort that's gone in, and use that to speed up their digital agenda. And if you aren't doing that, then I think that's a big thing for you to think about. I think the slightly more challenging aspect of it is that you know, now the expectations are high, right? We went from very little remote working in a lot of organisations to full-on remote working in a matter of weeks. So we've made changes very fast. It wouldn't be unreasonable for the business to say, why can't we go faster in the future? And I think that will put pressure on us as CIOs and leadership within IT to make that happen. So we'll need to go faster than we've been used to. That might mean taking more risk. It might mean actually doing things slightly differently. It might mean thinking in a more agile way, and I mean that in a small A rather than a big agile way. But certainly there's going to be a challenge there, I think, which is that I don't believe it will be right to go back to the pace of change that we used to have, and the bright organisations will make sure they don't, and therefore everyone will be forced to go that little bit faster moving forward. So what can you do differently today? So from all these things that we've spoken about, all the different aspects that came up through the interviews, what are the things that at the end of the day you need to think about as a leader from an IT sort of digital perspective inside your business? So I think a really fascinating one, lead on people and culture. So you do have a unique perspective. You understand digital, you understand the impact of digital, you understand the possibilities of digital. And so if you combine that with the people and the culture, that's a very powerful insight that you have, and you should be leading on that. You should be looking for ways to sustain the need and the desire to change at pace. I think for me, that means you need to think about ways of creating an environment for your business where change is safe, where there's a compelling reason to do it, that hopefully isn't as serious as C-19, but there is a compelling reason to do it, and that you need to think about consumer grade approach, so people feel safe. They're happy to open the box up and turn it on and see what happens when they press that button and that button and that button. They're not scared to do that. I think that will allow us to make change faster. And I think there's a big challenge on those that design solutions and design programs to think about that. I think going faster, we've got to think about how we can go faster. There are various ways we can achieve that, both in terms of a more agile way of thinking about things, more iterative type approach, getting our businesses used to the idea that we don't have to be perfect before we launch something would be an interesting thing we could try to think about doing, perhaps. And you have to think about that, because I think the majority of industry will be looking to move faster, and that means it becomes a competitive challenge. A few other little things as well I wanted to mention along the way. I think if you're not thinking about how your strategy is impacted by this, then you better start thinking about that. I believe you need to refresh your strategy. You need to start thinking about remote first. You need to be managing as a CIO your profile within the business. So I think C-19's proved that digital technology is massively important, and therefore the CIO role is massively important. You need to be thinking about how you make the best of this situation to manage that, and for the benefit of both yourself but also the business as a whole. I think there's a big challenge around innovation. How do you make innovation happen? A lot of people we interviewed said that's been much more difficult to do, and maybe even that's partly where some of the benefit of productivity has come from, which is we've not really changed that much, we've just done the job. And so I think that's okay in the short term, but actually if we don't innovate, we tend to lose out in the longer run. So we're going to have to think about how we make some of those things happen. Think about how you're managing fatigue, mental health. You do have the best insight to fix those sorts of problems, and I think it's down to you as CIOs to kind of lead that charge to a certain degree and work out what the social norms are, publicize them, and demonstrate them to help people get through that. Because I think certainly as we go into this sort of what seems to be a longer phase of the pandemic, people are going to need to find new ways of maintaining their energy and stop getting fatigued. And I think that's down to CIOs primarily to think about that. And then actually, I've mentioned at the bottom of this slide here, don't forget to do it all with security. It didn't come up that much actually in terms of the interviews. People weren't overly concerned about the security at this point in time, maybe because it was already covered, maybe because the risk profile wasn't considered that important in the middle of C-19. the reality is, if that's how people felt, that was a bit of an illusion. You know, C-19 has never been an excuse for a cyber incident. So I think don't forget to think about security with everything that you're doing moving forward. And I think it's just something that we have to make sure is systemic to everything that we do. In many respects, remote working introduces more exposure to us to attacks, so something you definitely need to think about. Overall, though, look, C-19 is a tragedy. I go back to remind you, people have lost their lives, and you know, there's really nothing we can say really to compensate for that in any way, shape, or form. We should take the time here and there to think about that. I certainly do. But we have to make the best of the situation, and for digital leaders, basically the opportunity is there to have a massively positive impact on your business despite the challenges of C-19, and I think that is your role. And pretty much everyone I spoke to and interviewed, they knew that was what their role was, and they were actively planning on how they were going to do that and how they were going to do that more in the future. And hopefully there's been some ideas that I've spoken to you about here that you can take into your own business and maybe get a little action list together of what you need to do next and how to make the best of your role and the best impact inside your business. So thank you for taking the time to listen to this. I hope it's been useful. There's a link on this slide here, which you can get a copy of the slides. And actually there'll be a little bit of a form that you can fill in as well. So if you feel it would be worthy of a wider study, maybe some getting into different subject areas relating to digital, in relation to either C-19 or other areas, then it'd be interesting to let me know via this form that that's something you might be interested in seeing more of, or indeed participating in, having a discussion about. The scale of the study we did was quite small. It was with existing customers, so I think there is a possibility that a wider remit may prove interesting, but I'm really after you guys to let me know whether that's something that you would be interested in doing. So yes, thank you very much for your time.